Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one. At 32, she worked as a librarian in downtown Phoenix, spending her days organizing books and helping children find their favorite stories. Her small frame and soft-spoken nature made her almost invisible in crowds. People often overlooked her, assuming she was just another timid woman who wouldn't hurt a fly. But appearances can be deceiving. Every evening after work, Sarah would drive to the outskirts of town to visit her elderly father, Miguel, who lived alone in a modest house surrounded by desert landscape. Miguel had been a boxing trainer for over 40 years, running a small gym that had produced several professional fighters. Though retired now, his weathered hands still carried the calluses of countless hours spent holding heavy bags and teaching young fighters the sweet science of boxing. Sarah's relationship with her father was complicated. As a child, she had watched him train fighters, seeing the dedication and discipline required. But Miguel had never pushed his only daughter toward fighting. He believed women should be protected, not taught to fight. This old-fashioned thinking had created a distance between them, especially after Sarah's mother died when she was 16. What Miguel didn't know was that Sarah had been secretly training for the past 8 years. After a terrifying incident in college where she was nearly assaulted walking to her car, Sarah realized she needed to be able to protect herself. She found a small private gym across town where an old trainer named Eddie worked with anyone willing to learn, regardless of gender. Eddie had immediately recognized something special in Sarah. Her quiet demeanor masked an intense focus and natural athleticism. She absorbed techniques like a sponge, spending hours perfecting her footwork combinations and defensive movements. Her small size became an advantage as she learned to move with lightning speed, slipping punches and countering with precision strikes. Sarah never told anyone about her training, not even her closest friends. She maintained her mild-mannered librarian persona, wearing loose clothing that hid the lean muscles she had developed. Her knuckles, though scarred from countless hours on the heavy bag, were hidden beneath hand cream and careful positioning. The trouble started on a Tuesday evening in late September. Sarah was leaving her father's house later than usual, having helped him organize his old boxing memorabilia. As she walked to her car, she noticed 3 men standing near a black sedan parked across the street. Something about their posture and the way they watched her made her uncomfortable. The men were clearly martial artists. Their confident stances and the way they moved suggested years of training. 2 wore black belts around their waists, proudly displaying their rank in what appeared to be karate or taekwondo. The third man, older and more muscular, had multiple stripes on his belt indicating advanced degrees of mastery. As Sarah reached her car, the men approached her. The leader, a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes, spoke first. His voice carried an air of authority mixed with something more sinister. "Excuse me, miss. We're looking for Miguel Martinez. We were told this is his address." Sarah's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "He's not available right now. Can I help you with something?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I think you can definitely help us. You see, your father owes us money, a significant amount from an old gambling debt. We've been very patient, but patience has its limits." Sarah knew her father had struggled with gambling in his younger years, but she thought those days were long behind him. The men continued talking, their voices growing more threatening with each word. "We're not unreasonable people," the second man chimed in, flexing his shoulders in a way that emphasized his muscular build. "We're willing to work out an arrangement. Your father can pay us back through his connections in the fight world, or—" He paused dramatically, looking Sarah up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Or perhaps his lovely daughter can find other ways to settle the debt. We know some people who would pay good money for someone like you." The implications hung in the air like poison. Sarah felt a familiar rage building inside her, the same fury that had driven her to train relentlessly for 8 years. These men thought she was helpless, just another victim they could intimidate and exploit. The third man, who had been silent until now, stepped closer. "Look, sweetheart, this doesn't have to get ugly. Your father's debt is $50,000. That's a lot of money for an old man and his librarian daughter. But we're offering you alternatives. Come with us now and we'll call it even." Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could scream, but they were in a remote area with no neighbors close enough to hear. She could run, but they would likely catch her before she reached safety. She could comply and hope for the best, but she knew exactly what that would lead to. Or she could fight. The men clearly didn't see her as a threat. They stood casually, their guard down, confident in their superiority. The leader even had his hands in his pockets, completely relaxed. "I need to think about this," Sarah said quietly, buying herself time to assess their positioning and plan her attack. "Thinking time is over, Princess," the muscular man said, reaching out to grab her arm. "We're taking you with us now." That was the moment Sarah's 8 years of secret training kicked in. As the man's hand reached for her, she moved with explosive speed. Her right hand shot forward in a perfect straight punch, connecting with his solar plexus with surgical precision. The blow drove the air from his lungs and doubled him over in pain. Before the other 2 men could react, Sarah had already shifted her stance, her weight balanced perfectly on the balls of her feet. The quiet librarian was gone, replaced by a fighter who had been waiting years for this moment. The leader's eyes widened in shock as he realized what had just happened. "What the hell?" Sarah didn't answer with words. Instead, she let her fists do the talking, launching into a combination that Eddie had made her practice thousands of times. Left hook to the body, right uppercut, left cross. Each punch landed with devastating accuracy. The men with black belts suddenly found themselves facing someone who fought with a different kind of skill entirely. Their traditional martial arts training, focused on forms and competition rules, was no match for Sarah's raw boxing techniques honed through years of intense, practical training. The real fight was just beginning, and these men had no idea what they had awakened. The second man, recovering from Sarah's initial assault, tried to grab her from behind while she was focused on his leader. But Sarah had been training for exactly these kinds of situations. Eddie had always emphasized awareness and never focusing on just one opponent when facing multiple attackers. She sensed the movement behind her and spun around, her elbow connecting with the man's ribs in a sharp upward strike. The impact sent him stumbling backward, clutching his side and gasping for air. His black belt, which he wore so proudly, suddenly seemed meaningless against Sarah's practical fighting skills. The leader, now fully alert to the danger, assumed a traditional karate stance. His movements were precise and disciplined, the result of decades of formal training. He launched a series of high kicks, each one technically perfect but telegraphed from miles away to someone who had spent years studying real fighting. Sarah slipped under his kicks with fluid grace, her head movement making him miss by inches. Every dodge was economical and purposeful, positioning her for counterattacks. As his third kick sailed over her ducked head, she came up with a devastating hook to his kidney area. The pain was immediate and intense, causing him to stumble and lose his balance. "Impossible," he muttered through gritted teeth. "You're just a librarian." "Looks can be deceiving," Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Years of controlling her emotions during training had taught her to stay composed even in the most intense situations. The third man, still winded from her initial punch, pulled out his phone and started recording. "Boss, we need to get this on video. Nobody's going to believe this otherwise." This infuriated Sarah even more. These men thought her fighting skills were some kind of entertainment, something to be recorded and probably shared with their criminal associates. The idea of being turned into a spectacle for their amusement ignited a deeper anger within her. She moved toward the man with the phone, her footwork impeccable as she cut off his angles of escape. He tried to back away while still recording, but Sarah was relentless. A quick jab to his wrist made him drop the phone, which shattered on the asphalt. Before he could react, she followed up with a combination to his body that left him doubled over and struggling to breathe. The leader had recovered enough to attack again, this time more cautiously. He could see that his earlier assessment had been completely wrong. This wasn't some helpless woman they could intimidate. This was a trained fighter who had been hiding her abilities behind a carefully constructed facade. He attempted a more conservative approach, using his reach advantage to keep her at a distance with jabs and straight punches. But Sarah had fought taller opponents countless times in training. Eddie had brought in fighters of all sizes to spar with her, teaching her how to get inside against longer-armed opponents. She used subtle head movements to slip his punches, each dodge bringing her closer to her optimal fighting range. When she finally got inside, she unleashed a barrage of body shots that would have made professional boxers proud. Her punches came in rapid succession, each one placed with surgical precision to maximize damage. The man's formal martial arts training had never prepared him for this kind of relentless pressure. In tournament competition, there were rules, referees, and protective gear. This was raw, street-level fighting where the only rule was survival. Sarah's smaller stature worked to her advantage as she worked inside his guard. Her punches came from angles he couldn't defend against, and her speed made it impossible for him to time effective counters. Within moments, he was backing away, his confidence completely shattered. "Who are you?" he demanded, blood trickling from his nose where one of her punches had connected. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead, not even breathing heavily despite the intense exchange. "I'm nobody special. Just a woman who learned to defend herself." The three men regrouped, their earlier cockiness replaced by genuine concern. They had expected an easy intimidation job, maybe having to rough up an old man and his helpless daughter. Instead, they found themselves being systematically dismantled by someone they had completely underestimated. "This isn't over," the leader said, trying to maintain some semblance of authority, despite his obvious defeat. "Your father still owes us money and we're not going away." Sarah stepped forward, her stance wide and balanced, ready for another round if necessary. "My father's debt is his business, but if you ever threaten me or my family again, you'll discover that what just happened was me being gentle." The threat in her voice was unmistakable. These men, despite their martial arts training and criminal connections, suddenly found themselves afraid of a librarian who weighed barely over 100 pounds. As they retreated to their car, the second man called out, "You have no idea who you're messing with, lady. We have connections you can't imagine." Sarah watched them drive away, her adrenaline still pumping but her mind already calculating what would come next. She knew this encounter was just the beginning. Men like these didn't give up easily, especially after being humiliated by someone they considered beneath them. She pulled out her own phone and called Eddie, her trainer and the only person who knew the full extent of her abilities. "Eddie, it's Sarah. We have a problem. Some men came looking for my father and things got physical." Eddie's gravelly voice came through the phone, filled with concern. "Are you hurt, kid?" "I'm fine, but they won't be giving up. They mentioned my father owes them $50,000 in gambling debts. These aren't street punks, Eddie. They're trained fighters, probably connected to organized crime." There was a pause on the other end of the line as Eddie processed this information. "Sarah, you need to be very careful. If these guys are who I think they might be, they won't take this kind of embarrassment lightly. They'll come back with more people and probably weapons." Sarah looked back at her father's house, knowing she couldn't let him get dragged into whatever was coming next. Miguel was too old and frail to defend himself, and his pride would never allow him to run or hide from his problems. "I know, Eddie, but I can't let them hurt my father. Whatever his mistakes were, he doesn't deserve what these men have planned." "Then we better make sure you're ready for what's coming next," Eddie replied. "Come to the gym tomorrow. We need to prepare you for war." As Sarah drove home that night, she knew her quiet life as an invisible librarian was over. The secret she had kept for 8 years was out, and now she would have to use every skill Eddie had taught her to protect the people she loved. The unlikely fighter had revealed herself, and there was no going back. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to the library for the first time in 3 years. Her supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, was so surprised that she asked twice if Sarah was sure she needed the day off. Sarah had built such a reputation for reliability that her absence seemed almost impossible. Instead of organizing books and helping patrons, Sarah drove across town to Eddie's gym, a run-down building tucked between an auto repair shop and a Mexican restaurant. The faded sign outside barely hung on by one chain, but inside, the gym was a temple of serious training. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling beams, speed bags rattled under the fists of dedicated fighters, and the smell of sweat and determination filled the air. Eddie was waiting for her, his weathered face showing concern mixed with pride. At 68, he had seen everything the fighting world had to offer. He had trained champions and street fighters, each one teaching him something new about human nature and the will to survive. "Tell me everything that happened," Eddie said, leading Sarah to a quiet corner where they could talk privately. Sarah recounted the entire encounter, describing each opponent's fighting style, their positioning, and how they reacted to her attacks. Eddie listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. His experienced eye could visualize the fight based on her detailed description. "You did good, kid," Eddie said when she finished. "But you're right about them coming back. Men like that, Especially when they're connected to organized crime, they can't let this slide. It's not just about the money anymore. It's about respect and reputation. Sarah had been thinking about this all night. Eddie, I need to know more about my father's debt. $50,000 doesn't just happen overnight. There has to be more to this story. Eddie rubbed his grizzled chin, considering his words carefully. Your father and I go way back, Sarah. We trained fighters together in the old days. Miguel was one of the best trainers in the state, but he had demons he couldn't shake. The revelation that Eddie knew her father surprised Sarah. In 8 years of training, Eddie had never mentioned this connection. Why didn't you ever tell me? She asked. Because Miguel made me promise never to contact him or his family. When you showed up here 8 years ago, I recognized the name immediately. You have his eyes and his natural fighting instinct, but I respected his wishes and never said anything. Eddie walked over to his office, a cluttered space filled with fight posters, old newspaper clippings, and decades of memories. He pulled out a thick file folder and brought it back to Sarah. Your father wasn't just gambling on horses or cards, kid. He was involved in underground fighting circuits. The kind where serious money changes hands and dangerous people make the rules. Sarah opened the folder to find photographs, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be betting records from various illegal fighting events. Her father's name appeared repeatedly, sometimes as a trainer, sometimes as someone placing substantial bets. The men who came after you work for Vincent Torino, Eddie continued. He runs most of the underground fighting in this part of the state. Your father trained some fighters for Torino's events, but he also bet heavily on matches he thought were fixed. When those fights didn't go as expected, Miguel ended up owing more money than he could ever repay. Sarah studied the documents, her anger growing with each page. Her father had not only hidden his gambling problems from her, but he had also gotten involved with criminals who wouldn't hesitate to hurt innocent people to collect their debts. How long has he owed this money? Sarah asked. According to my sources, about 2 years. Torino's been patient because he respected Miguel's reputation in the fighting community, but patience only goes so far in that world. Eddie pulled out a more recent document, this one showing Sarah's father's home address and detailed information about his daily routines. Someone had been watching Miguel closely, learning his patterns and vulnerabilities. They've been planning this collection for months, Sarah. What happened last night wasn't random. They knew exactly when and where to find you. This information made Sarah even more determined to protect her father, despite his poor decisions. She couldn't let criminals terrorize an elderly man, regardless of his past mistakes. I need to train harder, Eddie. If they're coming back with more people, I need to be ready for anything. Eddie smiled grimly. I was hoping you'd say that. But we're not just going to train you to defend yourself. We're going to prepare you to go on the offensive. For the next several hours, Eddie put Sarah through the most intense training session of her life. They worked on fighting multiple opponents, dealing with weapons, and most importantly, developing the killer instinct necessary to survive against truly dangerous adversaries. Fighting in the gym is different from fighting for your life, Eddie explained as Sarah worked the heavy bag with devastating combinations. In the gym, you pull your punches. On the street, against men who want to hurt you and your family, you fight to end the threat permanently. Sarah's punches grew harder and more vicious as she internalized Eddie's words. The quiet librarian was disappearing completely, replaced by a focused predator who understood what was at stake. During a break, Eddie introduced Sarah to Marcus, a former professional fighter who had competed in several underground events for Torino's organization before getting out of that world. Marcus knows these people, Eddie explained. He can tell you what you're really up against. Marcus was a massive man covered in scars from years of brutal fights, but his eyes were intelligent and kind, showing that he had maintained his humanity despite the violence he had experienced. Vincent Torino doesn't send 3 men to collect $50,000, Marcus told Sarah. He sends 3 men to send a message. The money is secondary. He wanted to establish dominance over your father and probably planned to use you as leverage. This confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the previous night's encounter. The good news is that you embarrassed his collectors, Marcus continued. That gives you a psychological advantage. They underestimated you once and they'll be more cautious next time. But it also makes them more dangerous. Torino can't let word spread that a librarian beat up his enforcers. Marcus pulled up photos on his phone showing various fighters who worked for Torino's organization. These are the people you might face next. Each one is a killer who's won dozens of underground matches. They don't follow rules and they don't show mercy. Sarah studied each face, memorizing their builds and fighting stances. Eddie had taught her to prepare for every opponent by understanding their strengths and finding their weaknesses. As the day progressed, Sarah felt herself changing on a fundamental level. The transformation that had begun the night before was accelerating. She was no longer hiding her abilities or pretending to be someone she wasn't. When she finally left the gym that evening, Sarah drove directly to her father's house. It was time for an honest conversation about his debts, his choices, and what they were both going to do about Vincent Torino. The unlikely fighter was preparing for war, and she intended to win. Sarah found her father sitting on his back porch, staring out at the desert landscape as the sun began to set. Miguel looked older than his 73 years. His shoulders slumped with the weight of secrets and regrets. When he heard her footsteps, he didn't turn around. "I've been expecting you," he said quietly. "Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street called. She saw some men bothering you last night." Sarah sat down in the chair next to him, the same chair where she used to sit as a child, listening to his stories about the boxing gym and the fighters he had trained. Those had been simpler times before she understood the complexity of adult problems and the consequences of poor decisions. "Dad, we need to talk about Vincent Torino and the money you owe him." Miguel's head dropped even lower. "How do you know about Vincent?" "Because 3 of his men tried to kidnap me last night to settle your debt." Sarah's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "They offered to let me work off $50,000 in ways I don't think either of us wants to discuss." For the first time, Miguel looked directly at his daughter. His eyes were filled with shame and fear, emotions she had never seen in the man who had always seemed so strong and confident. "Milla, I never wanted you to get involved in this. That's why I never told you. I thought I could handle it. Maybe find a way to pay Vincent back without anyone getting hurt." Sarah leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "Dad, I'm already involved. They know who I am, where I live, where I work. There's no going back to pretending this isn't happening." Miguel stood up and began pacing, his hands shaking slightly. "You don't understand, Sarah. These aren't normal criminals. Vincent Torino has connections everywhere. Police, judges, politicians. He owns pieces of this city that you can't even imagine." "Then help me understand," Sarah said. "Tell me exactly how you got into debt with him and don't leave anything out." Over the next hour, Miguel told his daughter the complete story. It had started innocently enough, with him training a few fighters for underground matches. The money was good, much better than what he could make training amateurs at his regular gym. Vincent Torino had been friendly and respectful, treating Miguel like the legend he once was in the boxing community. But then Miguel started betting on the matches, convinced he could predict outcomes based on his knowledge of the fighters. At first he won more than he lost. The easy money became addictive, especially after Sarah's mother died and medical bills had eaten up most of their savings. "I got overconfident," Miguel admitted. "I started making bigger bets, borrowing money from Vincent to place even larger wagers. I was so sure I knew which fighters were going to win. The problem came when Miguel discovered that some matches were fixed, but not in the ways he expected. Fighters who were supposed to lose would suddenly fight harder than ever, and fighters who were supposed to win would mysteriously underperform. The betting patterns were controlled by people higher up in Torino's organization, people who didn't share information with trainers like Miguel. I lost everything, Mija. Our house has a second mortgage I never told you about. My retirement savings are gone. Even the old gym equipment I've been selling piece by piece. And I still owe Vincent $50,000 with interest accumulating every month." Sarah processed this information, understanding now why the men had been so confident about collecting their debt. They weren't just threatening an old man. They were threatening to take everything he had left in the world. "Why didn't you come to me for help?" Sarah asked. "I have some savings, and maybe together we could have figured something out." Miguel shook his head. "A librarian's salary? Sarah, you make maybe $30,000 a year. Even if you gave me every penny, it wouldn't make a dent in what I owe. And I couldn't ask you to sacrifice your future for my mistakes." Sarah stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the desert where she had played as a child. Her father had no idea that his quiet, bookish daughter had developed skills that could potentially solve this problem in ways he never imagined. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you, something I've been keeping secret for 8 years. She turned to face him, and Miguel was surprised by the change in her posture and expression. Gone was the mild-mannered librarian he thought he knew. In her place stood someone who moved with confidence and barely contained power. I've been training to fight, seriously training, with one of the best coaches in the state. I'm not the helpless daughter you think I am. Miguel's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Sarah, what are you talking about? You work at the library. You read books and help children with homework. That's what I do during the day, Sarah replied. But at night I've been learning to defend myself and others. Last night when those 3 men tried to take me, I fought back. I put all 3 of them on the ground. To prove her point, Sarah moved into a fighting stance, her balance perfect and her hands positioned like a trained boxer. The transformation was so complete that Miguel barely recognized his own daughter. This is impossible, he whispered. When did you learn to do this? How did I not know? Sarah relaxed her stance and sat back down. After Mom died, when I was in college, a man tried to attack me in a parking lot. I got away, but I realized I never wanted to feel helpless like that again. So I found a trainer and started learning to fight. Miguel was quiet for several minutes processing this revelation. His daughter, whom he had always tried to protect and shelter, had been secretly developing abilities that he had spent his entire career teaching to others. Who trained you? He asked finally. Eddie Morales. Miguel's eyes widened in shock. Eddie had been his closest friend and training partner for over 20 years before their falling out. Eddie trained you? For 8 years? He never told me he knew you until today. He said you made him promise never to contact you or your family. Miguel covered his face with his hands, overwhelmed by the implications of this information. His daughter had been training with his former best friend, developing skills that might actually be relevant to their current situation. Sarah, even if you can fight, you don't understand what you're up against. Vincent Torino's organization includes some of the most dangerous fighters in the country. These aren't just tough guys from the street. These are professional killers who compete in underground matches where people die. Sarah reached over and took her father's weathered hands in hers. Then it's a good thing I've been training with someone who understands that world. Eddie told me about Vincent Torino, Dad. He knows exactly what we're dealing with. Miguel looked into his daughter's eyes and saw something he had never noticed before. Behind the gentle exterior of the librarian was the focused intensity of a true fighter. She had inherited more from him than just his eyes and stubbornness. What are you proposing, Misha? Sarah smiled. And for the first time in years, Miguel saw confidence instead of resignation in her expression. I'm proposing we solve this problem the only way people like Vincent Torino understand. We fight back. The unlikely fighter was about to become something even more dangerous, a daughter protecting her family. 3 days later, Sarah's carefully constructed plan began to unfold. She had spent those days gathering intelligence, training intensively with Eddie, and preparing for what would either solve her father's debt problem permanently or get them both killed. The first step involved Marcus, Eddie's former fighter who had intimate knowledge of Vincent Torino's organization. Marcus had reluctantly agreed to help after Sarah convinced him that running away wasn't an option and that she was serious about taking the fight directly to Torino. There's an underground tournament next weekend, Marcus explained as they sat in Eddie's office, surrounded by fight photos and newspaper clippings. Vincent hosts it every 3 months. Big money, serious fighters and no rules except don't die in the ring if you can help it. Sarah studied the tournament information Marcus had provided. The entry fee was $10,000, but the winner would take home $50,000 plus any side bets they could arrange. More importantly, winning such a tournament would earn respect in Torino's world, the kind of respect that might make him willing to negotiate. This is insane, kid, Eddie said for the dozenth time. These tournaments aren't like anything you've ever experienced. People get crippled or killed. They bring in fighters from all over the country, professionals who've been doing this their whole lives. Sarah remained focused on the tournament details. How many fights would I need to win? Marcus pulled out a bracket from the last tournament. It's single elimination. Usually 16 fighters, so 4 fights to win it all. But Sarah, you need to understand that these aren't boxing matches. They allow kicking, grappling, submissions, pretty much everything except weapons and eye gouging. This was exactly what Sarah had been afraid of. Her training had been focused on boxing, with some basic self-defense techniques. She had never competed in mixed martial arts or dealt with fighters who could attack her with feet and grappling techniques. Eddie saw her concern and leaned forward. We have 1 week to expand your training. It's not enough time to make you a well-rounded martial artist, but we can teach you enough to survive and maybe even win. For the next week, Sarah's life became nothing but training. She quit her job at the library, telling Mrs. Henderson that she had a family emergency that required her full attention. It wasn't exactly a lie. Eddie brought in specialists to teach Sarah different aspects of fighting she had never encountered. A former wrestler taught her basic takedown defense and how to get back to her feet quickly if taken down. A kickboxer showed her how to check leg kicks and use her footwork to avoid being trapped against the cage. Most importantly, Marcus taught her the psychology of underground fighting. In a regular boxing match, you're trying to outpoint your opponent or knock them out cleanly, he explained as Sarah worked the heavy bag. In underground tournaments, you're trying to hurt people so badly they can't continue. The mindset is completely different. Sarah struggled with this concept initially. Her entire fighting philosophy had been built around self-defense and protecting others, not inflicting maximum damage for sport or money. But as she trained and prepared, she began to understand that this tournament was still about protection, just on a larger scale. She was protecting her father and herself from years of debt and intimidation. The physical preparation was brutal. Eddie pushed Sarah harder than he ever had before, forcing her body to adapt to new techniques and higher levels of intensity. Her hands, already scarred from years of heavy bag work, developed new calluses from grappling and ground fighting practice. But the mental preparation was even more challenging. Sarah had to transform herself from someone who fought reluctantly in self-defense into someone who could enter a cage and systematically dismantle trained killers. The quiet librarian had to disappear completely, replaced by someone capable of extreme violence when necessary. On the Thursday before the tournament, Vincent Torino himself arrived at Miguel's house with 4 bodyguards. Sarah watched from inside as the well-dressed man in his 50s stepped out of a black limousine and approached the front door. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told no and expected immediate compliance with his wishes. Miguel answered the door, his face pale but determined. Sarah could hear the conversation through the thin walls. "Miguel, my old friend," Torino said in a voice that managed to sound friendly and threatening at the same time. "I think we've been patient long enough. It's time to settle our business arrangement." "I need more time, Vincent. I'm working on getting the money together." Torino laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Time? Miguel, you've had 2 years. Interest and penalties have brought your debt up to $75,000. Even if you live another 20 years, you'll never earn that kind of money." Sarah moved closer to the window, watching the bodyguards position themselves around the property. They were professionals, alert and ready for trouble. But they were also overconfident, just like the 3 men who had underestimated her a week ago. "However," Torino continued, "I'm a reasonable businessman. I'm willing to make you an offer. Your daughter comes to work for me and we'll call the debt even. She's attractive and I have several businesses where she could be very useful." Miguel's voice rose in anger. "My daughter is off limits, Vincent. She has nothing to do with this." "Oh, but she does now. My men told me about her little display last week. Very impressive for a librarian. Perhaps she has other hidden talents that could be profitable." Sarah had heard enough. She opened the front door and stepped outside, immediately drawing the attention of all 5 men. But unlike a week ago, she wasn't trying to hide her capabilities. Her stance was confident and ready, her eyes focused and dangerous. "Mr. Torino, I presume," Sarah said calmly. "I think you and I need to have a conversation." Vincent studied her with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. "So this is the famous librarian who embarrassed 3 of my best collectors. You're smaller than I expected." "Size isn't everything," Sarah replied, stepping further onto the porch. "I have a proposition for you." Vincent's eyebrows raised with interest. "I'm listening." "Your tournament next weekend. I want to enter." The crime boss laughed genuinely this time, and his bodyguards joined in. "You want to enter my tournament? Little girl, do you have any idea what happens in those fights?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "If I win, my father's debt is forgiven completely. If I lose, I'll work for you however you see fit." The laughter stopped immediately. Vincent studied Sarah more carefully, seeing something in her demeanor that suggested this wasn't the desperate gamble it appeared to be. "You're serious," he said finally. "Completely serious. But I have conditions. The fight has to be clean. No interference from outside the cage, no weapons, standard tournament rules, whatever they are. And if I win, you leave my family alone permanently. Vincent walked closer to Sarah, his bodyguards tensing slightly. And what makes you think you could survive even one fight against the caliber of fighters I bring to these tournaments? Let me worry about that, Sarah said. The question is whether you're confident enough in your fighters to take the bet. Miguel stepped forward from the doorway. Sarah, no. You don't know what you're asking. Stay out of this, Dad, Sarah said without taking her eyes off Vincent. This is between Mr. Torino and me. Vincent was quiet for several moments considering the proposal. Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. From his perspective, it was a win-win situation. Either she would be destroyed in the first round, teaching both her and her father a lesson about challenging his authority, or she might actually provide some entertainment before inevitably losing. You realize the entry fee is $10,000, Vincent said. I'll have it. And you understand that fighters have died in my tournaments. Not often, but it happens. I'm not responsible for what occurs in that cage. Sarah nodded. I understand completely. Vincent smiled, the expression making him look like a shark that had just spotted wounded prey. Very well. I accept your proposition. But let me be clear about the terms. If you lose your first fight, you belong to me, not just for work, but completely. You become my property to do with as I see fit. The threat was obvious and disturbing, but Sarah had expected no less from a man like Vincent Torino. And if I win the entire tournament? If you win, which is impossible, your father's debt disappears completely and neither of you will ever hear from me again. Sarah extended her hand. Deal. Vincent shook it, his grip firm but not attempting to intimidate her physically. Deal. The tournament is Saturday night. The location will be sent to you Friday afternoon. As Vincent and his men prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah one final time. I hope you realize what you've just agreed to, Miss Martinez. My fighters don't just win their matches. They destroy their opponents completely, body and spirit. We'll see about that, Sarah replied. After the limousine disappeared down the desert road, Miguel grabbed his daughter's shoulders. Sarah, what have you done? Those tournaments are death matches. People don't walk away from them the same. Sarah looked at her father with a mixture of love and determination. Dad, I've been preparing for this my entire adult life without even knowing it. Every punch I've thrown, every combination I've practiced, every hour I've... The tournament location turned out to be an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, the kind of place where screams wouldn't attract attention, and cleanup crews worked without asking questions. Sarah arrived with Eddie and Marcus 2 hours before the scheduled start time, carrying a small gym bag containing hand wraps, mouthguard, and the $10,000 in cash that had required her to liquidate her entire savings account. The warehouse had been converted into a professional fighting venue, complete with a regulation cage, professional lighting, and bleacher seating for about 200 spectators. What struck Sarah most was how normal everything looked, as if this were a legitimate sporting event, rather than an underground tournament where serious injury was not just possible but expected. Vincent Torino sat in a makeshift VIP section, surrounded by well-dressed men and women who had clearly paid substantial amounts to witness the evening's violence. When he saw Sarah enter, he raised a glass of expensive whiskey in her direction, the gesture somehow managing to be both welcoming and mocking. Second thoughts yet? Marcus asked as they found seats near the fighter preparation area. Sarah watched the other competitors warming up and felt her stomach tighten with nervous energy. These weren't the overconfident martial artists she had fought outside her father's house. These were professional fighters who moved with the fluid grace of predators. Their bodies were covered in scars that told stories of countless battles, and their eyes held the cold focus of people who had learned to inflict damage without emotional attachment. No second thoughts, Sarah replied, though her voice carried less certainty than her words. Eddie had been unusually quiet during the drive to the warehouse, but now he leaned close to Sarah and spoke in the tone he reserved for his most serious advice. Listen to me very carefully, kid. Everything we've trained for comes down to the next few hours. These fighters are dangerous, but they all have the same weakness. They're used to fighting other professionals who approach combat the same way they do. You fight differently. You fight like someone whose life depends on every punch. The first 2 fights served as a brutal introduction to what Sarah had committed herself to. In the first match, a heavily tattooed fighter from Louisiana systematically destroyed a smaller opponent, with a combination of boxing and vicious leg kicks. The smaller fighter tried to surrender twice, but there was no referee to stop the fight. It only ended when he could no longer stand. The second fight was even worse. Two grapplers spent 15 minutes on the ground, each trying to break the other's limbs or choke them unconscious. When it finally ended, the winner couldn't walk without assistance, and the loser was carried out on a stretcher. "Jesus," Sarah whispered as she watched paramedics tend to the injured fighters. "What have I gotten myself into?" "Reality," Marcus replied grimly. "This is what Vincent's world really looks like when the pretense drops away." Sarah's first opponent was announced as Tommy the Butcher Morrison, a fighter from Detroit with a record of 37 wins and only 3 losses in underground competitions. He stood about 6 feet tall with the build of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of hurting people. When he looked at Sarah across the cage, his expression showed no recognition that she was a woman or that she might deserve any special consideration. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer called out over the crowd noise. In the red corner, weighing 108 pounds, making her tournament debut, Sarah Martinez. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of laughter and anticipation. Many of the spectators had clearly bet against her surviving the first round, and they were looking forward to watching their predictions come true. And in the blue corner, weighing 175 pounds, with a record of 37-3, Tommy the Butcher Morrison. The size difference was intimidating, but Sarah forced herself to remember everything Eddie had taught her about fighting larger opponents. Speed, angles, and precision would have to overcome raw power and experience. When the fight began, Tommy immediately tried to use his reach advantage to keep Sarah at a distance with jabs and straight punches. But Sarah had spent years learning to get inside against taller opponents. She slipped his punches with subtle head movement and worked her way closer with each exchange. The first real exchange came when Tommy threw a looping overhand right that Sarah saw coming from across the cage. She ducked under it and came up with an uppercut that caught him flush on the chin. The crowd's laughter died immediately as Tommy staggered backward, his eyes glazed from the unexpected power behind Sarah's punch. "Holy shit," someone in the crowd yelled. "The librarian can actually fight." Tommy recovered quickly and changed his strategy, trying to use his wrestling background to take the fight to the ground, where his size advantage would be overwhelming. But Sarah had spent the last week learning basic takedown defense, and more importantly, she had developed the kind of balance and core strength that made her difficult to control. When Tommy shot in for a takedown, Sarah sprawled perfectly, keeping her hips away from his grasping hands. As he struggled to complete the takedown, she wrapped her arm around his neck and began landing short punches to his ribs and kidneys. Each punch was designed to inflict maximum damage in minimum space. The crowd began to shift their attention from casual entertainment to genuine interest. Sarah wasn't just surviving against a dangerous opponent. She was actually winning exchanges and making Tommy work harder than he had expected. After 5 minutes of intense fighting, both fighters were breathing heavily, but Sarah looked noticeably fresher. Her years of conditioning and Eddie's emphasis on efficiency were paying dividends against an opponent who relied more on strength than technique. The end came suddenly. Tommy, frustrated by his inability to dominate the smaller fighter, abandoned his game plan and rushed forward with his hands low, intending to simply overwhelm Sarah with brute force. It was exactly the kind of mistake that Sarah had been trained to capitalize on. She stepped to the side as Tommy charged, letting his momentum carry him past her. As he stumbled forward off balance, Sarah threw a perfect left hook that caught him behind the ear. The punch landed with a sound like a baseball bat hitting leather, and Tommy collapsed instantly, unconscious before he hit the canvas. The warehouse fell silent for several seconds before erupting into chaos. Half the crowd was celebrating their unexpected windfall from betting on the underdog, while the other half was screaming about the impossibility of what they had just witnessed. Vincent Torino was no longer smiling. He leaned forward in his VIP section, studying Sarah with the intensity of someone who had just realized that his evening might not go according to plan. Sarah helped the still dazed Tommy to his feet, supporting his weight until his corner could take over. Despite everything he had represented as an opponent, she felt no satisfaction in his defeat. This wasn't about personal animosity. It was about survival and protecting her family. 1 down, 3 to go, Eddie said as Sarah returned to their corner, but his voice carried a mixture of pride and concern. They're going to study that footage and adjust their approach for your next fight. Sarah looked across the warehouse at the remaining fighters, each one now watching her with the serious attention reserved for legitimate threats. The element of surprise was gone. From now on, every opponent would come into the cage knowing exactly how dangerous she could be. The unlikely fighter had announced herself to Vincent Torino's world in the most dramatic way possible. Now she had to prove that her first victory wasn't just luck. Sarah's second opponent was a completely different challenge. Maria the Spider Vega was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu specialist who had earned her nickname by trapping opponents in submission holds that seemed impossible to escape. Unlike Tommy, who had relied on power and aggression, Maria was patient and calculating, looking for opportunities to drag the fight to the ground where her grappling expertise would be decisive. The crowd's attitude toward Sarah had completely changed after her first victory. The laughter was gone, replaced by intense focus as people realized they were watching something special unfold. Vincent Torino had moved closer to the cage, his expression unreadable as he watched his carefully planned evening spiral into unexpected territory. "This is where it gets dangerous," Marcus warned during the break between fights. "Maria is smart enough to have learned from Tommy's mistakes. She won't rush in or underestimate you. She'll try to make this a technical fight where experience matters more than power." Eddie wiped sweat from Sarah's face with a cold towel, his weathered hands steady despite the tension of the moment. "Remember what we worked on with the wrestler. Stay on your feet, stay moving, and don't let her control your wrists. If she gets you down, get back up immediately." When the fight began, Maria circled slowly, studying Sarah's stance and movement patterns. She threw tentative kicks to test Sarah's reactions, probing for weaknesses without committing to any serious attacks. It was the approach of a seasoned predator who understood that patience often defeated power. Sarah tried to pressure Maria with boxing combinations, but the Brazilian was too experienced to be drawn into a striking battle she couldn't win. Every time Sarah moved forward, Maria would circle away, occasionally shooting in for takedown attempts that she abandoned as soon as Sarah defended properly. After 3 minutes of tactical maneuvering, Maria finally found her opening. Sarah threw a slightly overextended right hand and Maria ducked under it, while simultaneously grabbing Sarah's lead leg. Before Sarah could react, she was on her back with Maria positioned in her guard, exactly where the Brazilian specialist wanted the fight. What happened next demonstrated the difference between someone who had trained grappling for a week and someone who had lived it for 15 years. Maria moved with fluid precision, transitioning from position to position while Sarah struggled to keep up with the complex chess match happening on the ground. Within seconds, Maria had advanced to mount, sitting on Sarah's chest with her knees pinning Sarah's arms. The crowd sensed that the Cinderella story was about to end as Maria began raining down punches toward Sarah's face. But Sarah's boxing background, even in this compromised position, served her well. She used her head movement to avoid most of Maria's strikes while working to create space to escape. More importantly, she didn't panic. Eddie's training had emphasized that ground fighting, like boxing, was about patience and technique rather than desperate scrambling. When Maria raised both hands to land a particularly hard punch, Sarah exploded her hips and rolled, using Maria's momentary lack of base to reverse their positions. Suddenly, Sarah was on top in Maria's guard, with the Brazilian looking genuinely surprised for the first time in the fight. Sarah had no intention of trying to match Maria's ground skills. Instead, she immediately began working to stand up, using her boxing footwork to create distance as soon as she got back to vertical. Maria attempted to hold on to Sarah's legs and drag her back down, but Sarah's balance and core strength allowed her to stay upright. Back on their feet, the fight's momentum had completely shifted. Maria's confidence was shaken by Sarah's escape, and she became more aggressive in her takedown attempts. This played directly into Sarah's strengths, as desperate takedown attempts often left shooters vulnerable to uppercuts and knee strikes. The end came when Maria, frustrated by her inability to control the smaller fighter, attempted a single-leg takedown that left her head in perfect position for Sarah's devastating left uppercut. The punch lifted Maria off her feet and sent her crashing to the canvas, unconscious before she landed. 2 fights down, 2 dramatic knockouts. The warehouse was now completely focused on Sarah, with spectators standing on their seats to get better views of the woman who was systematically destroying Vincent Torino's carefully selected field of fighters. Sarah's Semi-final opponent was perhaps the most dangerous fighter she had faced yet. Viktor the Executioner Kozlov was a former Russian military fighter who had competed in underground tournaments across 3 continents. His style was brutally efficient, combining boxing, kickboxing, and military combat training into a package designed to end fights as quickly and violently as possible. "This guy's different," Marcus warned as Sarah prepared for her 3rd fight of the evening. "He's not just a fighter. He's a professional soldier who's killed people with his bare hands. He won't make the same mistakes the others made." Sarah was beginning to feel the accumulated damage from her previous fights. Her ribs ached from Maria's ground control, and her hands were swelling despite the protective wrapping. But her conditioning remained strong, and more importantly, her confidence was building with each victory. Viktor studied Sarah with the cold assessment of someone who had made a career of identifying and exploiting weaknesses in human beings. When the fight began, he immediately implemented a strategy designed to neutralize Sarah's speed advantage by cutting off the cage and limiting her movement options. Unlike her previous opponents, Viktor showed no emotion when Sarah landed clean punches. He absorbed her shots with minimal reaction and continued pressing forward, working to trap her against the cage where his size and strength advantages would be most pronounced. The breakthrough came when Viktor caught one of Sarah's kicks and immediately transitioned to a takedown. But instead of trying to grapple with Sarah on the ground, he used his wrestling skills simply to slam her hard against the canvas before letting her back up. The message was clear. He could put her down whenever he wanted, and each trip to the ground would accumulate damage. Sarah realized she was facing someone who understood exactly how to neutralize her advantages while maximizing his own. Viktor wasn't going to make emotional mistakes or abandon his game plan out of frustration. He was going to systematically break her down until she could no longer defend herself. But Sarah had advantages that Viktor didn't fully understand. Her 8 years of training with Eddie hadn't just developed her physical skills. They had forged a mental toughness that allowed her to function under extreme pressure. When Viktor increased his pressure, Sarah didn't crack. Instead, she adapted. She began using Viktor's aggression against him, letting him pursue her around the cage while landing sharp counters each time he committed to attacks. Viktor's military training had emphasized overwhelming force and quick finishes, but it hadn't prepared him for an opponent who could absorb punishment while consistently landing precise, damaging strikes in return. The turning point came in the final minute of what had been a grueling 12-minute battle. Viktor, showing the first signs of fatigue from his relentless pressure, attempted a takedown that Sarah saw coming. She stuffed his attempt and immediately countered with a knee strike that caught him flush in the solar plexus as he shot in. Viktor doubled over, the wind driven from his lungs, and Sarah immediately followed up with the same left hook that had finished her previous opponents. Viktor managed to partially block the punch, but the accumulated damage from 12 minutes of precise counterstriking had weakened his defenses. He went down hard and didn't get up, 3 opponents down, 1 to go. The warehouse had become electric with anticipation as spectators realized they were witnessing something that would be talked about in underground fighting circles for years to come. But Sarah's final opponent represented the biggest challenge yet. Jake the Monster Williams was Vincent Torino's personal enforcer, a man who had never lost an underground fight and whose reputation for both skill and cruelty was legendary throughout the criminal world. As Sarah prepared for the championship bout, Vincent Torino approached her corner for the first time all evening. His expression was no longer calculating or amused. It was deadly serious. "Miss Martinez," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I've honored our agreement completely. Your fights have been clean, and my fighters have shown you the same respect they would show any opponent." Sarah nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading. "But Jake is different," Vincent continued. "He doesn't just work for me. He's like a son to me. If you hurt him badly, our agreement might become complicated regardless of the tournament outcome." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah had come too far to be intimidated now. "Mr. Torino," she replied calmly, "I'm going to treat Jake exactly the same way I've treated every other opponent tonight, with respect but without mercy." Vincent studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then may the best fighter win." As Vincent returned to his seat, Sarah looked across the cage at Jake Williams. He was easily the largest and most intimidating opponent she had faced, but more than that, he radiated the kind of controlled violence that came from years of hurting people professionally. But Sarah was no longer the quiet librarian who had walked into this warehouse hours earlier. She had proven to herself